Modern period, part 3. We're talking about the Cold War. So we just got into it, right? The Cold War, the root of it is Marxism, and then Leninism, Leninist version of Marxism. And then when he died early, 1922. Joseph Stalin took over, and he was a monster. One of these uh, very clear-cut monsters in history. I guess Hitler's one of them. Uh, I mean, Lenin did some monstrous things too, apparently, but not like Stalin. Stalin. I keep saying Stalin, and then somebody said it's not Stalin, it's Stalin. Uh, Early confrontations, it started from even before World War II finished. And Winston Churchill, he gave this really famous speech. An iron curtain has descended across the continent. And that, you could say, is the beginning of the Cold War, where he announced it, right? The Iron Curtain. And in response, the United States pushed its Marshall Plan, ERP, European Recovery Plan. And I think this is where we ended. NATO was also founded, centered around the United States, a guarantee for Western nations against Soviet aggression. Also, one of the I guess side purposes was to make sure that Germany would never become a militant country again. And Germany happily replied, yes, never again. Because Germany has 2 strikes against them, right? If Germany should rise up again as, some military fascist country, we'll nuke them all, right? 3 strikes and you're out. We should just get rid of, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say things like that. But I know the situation is totally different, but you do worry a little bit when you see Germany changing. Germany is changing right now. It's something like Japan. What Japan is becoming a bit more militaristic, right? They're about to change their constitution, right? They want to get rid of Japan not having a military of its own. And Germany is becoming more militaristic. And everybody thinks that is a very good thing because of Russia, right? Russia has become this sort of cancerous, dark side of, I don't know, the force. And in order to resist Russian imperialism, I suppose, we need all European countries to stand together, including Germany, right? So, I mean, we can't read into it too much, but it is a sad thing to see that these countries are turning more to like spending more money for their defenses and becoming more militaristic. We were talking about China. I don't think it was this class. We were talking about China. No, I'm sure we'll get to that later. And I have some comment to make regarding China and the US. But so this is where we left off. And then in 1949, the atomic bomb tested by the Soviet Union. This was a sort of a watershed moment, right? Because so starting from 1945 to 1949, the United States had, in a way, absolute power because it was the only country with nuclear capabilities. And Professor Fears, who, I mentioned a few times, I told you he's a very America-centric person, is a gung-ho, like American apologist. What he said about this period, he said was the United States had this chance. There was this window of opportunity for a few years, right? When the United States could have reached and grabbed power, right? Everyone wants power in history. History teaches us that power is a universal, I don't know, is a universal. Everyone wants power. And at this point, the United States had a chance to become the absolute dictator of the entire world, right? If it wanted to be that, because it was the only country with atomic capability. About the only time in history when one country could have become the absolute dictator of the entire planet. And someone like Professor Fears, I think he says, not in so many words, I think he thinks it was an opportunity lost. Only if the United States had taken that bold step, right, and taken over the world, maybe we would be living in a much better world now. We would not have had the Cold War. We would not have, these conflicts in the world right now. Maybe we would all be Americans. I, I, I'm giving too much to the United States, but it is true. There was an opportunity for the United States for at least a few years, right, where they thought they were untouchable. And there's a whole story behind how the Soviet Union came in possession of the atomic bomb. It had to do with ideology. There were communists, right? Scientists who were working for the Soviet Union because they really believed the United States should not be the only country with this kind of awesome godlike power. So they gave the Soviet Union the secrets. And once that happened, uh, this is the Cold War. It ended US monopoly, triggered the arms race, building ever more higher number of atomic bombs and then hydrogen bombs. And yeah, this is a bomb going off. We'll call it the mushroom cloud, a mushroom cloud. So we're just going to go very quickly through some of these events that happened. Korean War happened 1950 to 53. I think what they say is this was the first test case of the New World Order. This was the first test case for the Cold War, where the United States and the Soviet Union dared not fight each other directly, but they started fighting each other through proxies. And the Korean War was the first case in point. Kim Il-sung had to get the go-ahead from Stalin. Stalin gave Kim Il-sung his blessings, but he said, we're not going to get involved. We're just going to, watch from afar. And to people's surprise, China actually got involved in the war. That was a surprise. War between North Korea and the UN forces, like Arthur, China joined with over 2.4 million soldiers. The story of how China joined in the Korean War, it included Mao Zedong's own son. Apparently, Mao Zedong's own son was part of the Chinese army and he died in the Korean War. So that's a bit of a human element there. And I think I said this a few times. Officially, the century of humiliation ended in 1949 when the People's Republic of China was founded. But some Chinese scholars would say this is when the century of humiliation ended, because this is when they defeated these foreign powers for the first time. They fought against the superpower United States and beat them back. I think this is like one of those propaganda posters. This is the American green men, right? And here are the brothers, communist brothers. This is North Korean soldier, and that's the Chinese soldier. Um, One interesting story from this period is MacArthur was furious that China got involved, right? He said, like, how dare these Chinese get involved in something that was not theirs? It wasn't their war, right? Why did they get involved? And he wanted to nuke China. It wasn't just a speculation. He wanted the authority to use the atomic bombs and drop them in China. And because he was so adamant about using the nuclear weapon, right? We used it once. Why not again? Harry Truman famously had to fire him very publicly. It made headline news because later on he would say something like, "Oh, all generals never die" or something. They fade away. But this was a shocking event that happened, and he had to do it. Truman had to fire him because MacArthur kept saying, I need the authority to drop the atomic bomb. Um, one could imagine what might have happened if the atomic weapon had been used. The missile crisis of 1962. So we don't want to spend too much time in any of these things, but we just want to cover these events. Uh, Khrushchev, Khrushchev, uh, he had de-Stalinized the Soviet Union because they started discovering all the monstrous things that Stalin had done. And de-Stalinization, I imagine, is part of it is de-Russification of the Soviet Union because Stalin basically Russified, like Russianized the Soviet Union, and they were trying to dismantle that. And this is Khrushchev. And the story goes that when he was already a sort of savvy politician, and John F. Kennedy was this young kid that Khrushchev had no respect for. He thought he could push John F. Kennedy around. And I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of the story. The space race began in 1957. Sputnik, that's the Soviet Union's. So they were ahead of the United States. And because space race was seen as so important in the Cold War, whoever dominates the outer space will win the Cold War or something. That was a part of the military calculation. This was a military thing. And it ended with the United States winning with Apollo 11 landing on the moon in 1969. Of course, Kennedy died in 1963, but his vision kept NASA going. And it was a Herculean, they say a Herculean effort, how the United States beat the Soviet Union. Right, the Berlin crisis of 1961. This was, again, Khrushchev's dare. Like, we're going to wall off Berlin, and let's see what you guys do, right? We dare you to fight us, right? And instead of fighting the Soviet Union, JFK, he famously started airlifting all the supplies and food. So that was called the Berlin crisis, and Khrushchev, I think, ended up being kind of humiliated because JFK didn't do what he thought he would do, either just give Berlin to the Soviet Union or start a fight. But that didn't happen. Cuban Revolution happened in 1959, where Fidel Castro defeats Batista government. Batista was apparently originally a hero in Cuba, and then he turned into a bit of a dictator toward the end. And the United States supported him, even though he was this dictator, because he was anti-communist. And so Fidel Castro, very popular, a Marxist, he took over the government. And once Fidel Castro came into power, the United States began to see Cuba as unacceptable. We cannot have a communist country in our like in our neighborhood, in our backyard. So they started planning things like the CIA started planning to bring down the communist government. And one of those plans was called the Bay of Pigs invasion. It wasn't well organized, but it was CIA supported and it failed miserably. It wasn't anything violent. It's just some Cubans who had fled to the United States. And they thought very naively, all they had to do was the Americans are here, right? We are Cubans coming back to take over our government, that the other Cubans would greet them and get rid of Fidel Castro, but they had everything wrong. All the intelligence was wrong. But the Bay of Pigs incident, this is 1961, right? But that convinced Castro that the United States would not leave Cuba alone. He said they're going to keep threatening us, trying to bring down our government. So we need some kind of guarantee to make sure the Americans will leave us alone. And his plan was talk to the Soviet Union, get them to bring some nuclear weapons to Cuba. That was his plan. Once we have nuclear weapons in Cuba, they will leave us alone. So this started this Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. And Khrushchev, he again naively believed John F. K. was a pushover, right? So he thought, yeah, let's do this, right? Let's get some nuclear weapons in Cuba, and then the Americans, like, they won't be so smug anymore. Um, it'll wake them up to, it'll make them respect us more. That was the thinking. And so the missile crisis, this happened. It wasn't a long lasting thing. It started on October 16th and 28th. So what is that? Like only 12 days. But it was a crisis because I don't know all the details, but it was a crisis because the Americans started saying, this is unacceptable. They started blockading the Soviet Union, the Russian ships. And then they had um, submarines underwater, very near the United States, coastal waters. And because the United States and the Soviet Union were not communicating, they didn't have this red phone that you see in the movies, right? They did not have a red, like a hotline. They didn't have a line of communication. Much of it had to be guesses, right? We're guessing that this is what they're doing, and we're just um, we're going to predict that this is what they're going to do. They're going to back down, and so this was, in a way, like two cars. What do you call this game of chicken, right? Two cars heading toward each other, right? I'm not going to move. I'm not going to, you move, right? No, I'm not going to move. You move. They were on a collision course, and the public didn't realize how closely we came to having an all-out nuclear war during this time, 12-day period, until the early 2000s, when they started releasing these highly classified, top classified documents. What had happened then, this is Fidel Castro, this is Khrushchev, this crazy old man. Oh, my son, yes, yes. Uh, what is that? Comrade, right? Comrade Castro. What had happened was there was this submarine. The Americans knew that there was this submarine. This is in the American waters, right? And the name of the submarine is called B-59. That was the name of the submarine. They thought it was a regular submarine. They started attacking it. So it was hiding underwater. What they didn't know was that this was a nuclear submarine. They had nuclear warheads inside the submarine. And the people inside the submarine, they had no way of contacting anyone. So they were isolated, and they thought the nuclear war had already started. And so the commanders inside the submarine said, we have to launch our nuclear weapons. And I think, I forgot the details now. I think apparently 2 or 3 of the commanders had to all agree to, I guess, maybe turn these keys, right? And start launching the weapons. And this one guy, Vasily Arkhipov, senior Soviet naval officer, he alone said we should not. What if we're wrong, right? If we launch nuclear weapons, they were in American coastal waters. If we launch our nuclear weapons now, that means for sure we're starting a nuclear Armageddon, right? Everyone dies. He resisted, and so they did not fire the weapons. Apparently, what ended up happening was they ended up contacting the American Navy. And they said, look, we're a nuclear submarine, right? You don't want to keep attacking us. And then the American Navy guided them back to the Soviet waters. This did not come out, this fact did not come out until the early 2000s. So the Americans had not been aware, right, was armed with nuclear torpedo of roughly the power of the bomb which was dropped on Hiroshima. Robert McNamara, Kennedy's defense secretary, said the nuclear war had come much closer than anyone had thought. Thomas Blanton, director of, right, Vasily Arkhipov had saved the world. It's always the Russians that saved the world. This guy, a Russian soldier, because he said no, we avoided the nuclear Armageddon. And because of this, they started saying, we cannot have this kind of thing happen again. So this is when the Cold War entered this era of detente. They call it detente. Let's bring the level down a little bit, right? Things are too tense. Let us relax things a little bit. Let us have a line of communication so that we'll never have this kind of miscommunication, misunderstanding each other. And then, because we could end all human civilization. Uh, you guys need to think about this a little bit. During the entirety for these several decades of the Cold War, right? At any time, these guys could have killed all of us. Us. We have nothing to do with these guys, right? But if they had fired their nuclear weapons, it would have destroyed Korea. It would have destroyed China. It would have destroyed the entire planet. I'm not saying all human beings would have died, but it would have definitely destroyed human civilization. Uh, I don't know if you guys know about the nuclear winter. They talk about nuclear winter. If enough atomic bombs go off at the same time, it creates this thing called the nuclear winter, right? It'll be like a second ice age. Um, and the fallout, the nuclear radioactive fallout would just kill everyone living on the surface. So that was the kind of thing that happened, this unique thing that happened in history, the Cold War. Some people are saying, are we entering another second Cold War now with the United States and China? We don't know. No, it's not like that. It's not like that. I don't think. So this is from 1963 to 79 called Detente, and this is when Vietnam War happened. Vietnam War happened. It started, I think I put this in the dates section. Officially, it started in 1955, right? But I wrote 1965 here because this is when the United States physically got involved. Before then, from 1955 to 65, there were like military advisors advising. Um, and then starting from 65, they started sending their own military. And this type of proxy conflict would become the norm in Cold War, where the Soviet Union and the United States or the UN forces, they would, try to defend freedom against these, godless communists. And apparently the story is, to be fair to the Soviet Union, later on, these classified documents, when they were unclassified, they realized it was really never that the Soviet Union wanted to take over the world. It was much more of a defensive posture, and they were not the highly organized evil empire that people made them out to be. They were a lot less organized in reality, but perception and reality during this time were very different, right? There was always the propaganda, right? We are doing better than you. Like our economy is doing better than your economy, that kind of thing. So because of propaganda, I guess you could say the fog of war, right? Even though this was the Cold War. So that's the Vietnam War. And this is when they produced MPT. I talked about this a few times already. This is considered the most successful political achievement in human history because it involved 190 countries signed up to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And this, I can't talk about this enough. This was based on a false promise. I mean, now we know this was based on a false promise because the nuclear powers, the five official nuclear powers said, we promise we will get rid of our nuclear weapons, right? Because we realize, through the crisis, right? Something like the Cuban Missile Crisis, that we could annihilate the entire civilization. We don't want that kind of thing to continue. So we will get rid of our nuclear weapons. But first, what we need you guys to do is promise us that you guys will not develop nuclear weapons. Like we only have five nuclear weapon countries. Isn't that enough, right? Could you imagine what would happen if, dozens of countries ended up having nuclear weapons? Then that increases the chance of human beings annihilating each other dramatically, right? We should not let that happen. So let us freeze the proliferation of the treaties. I think there's a story, I'm not sure about the details, but they called it, I'm going to say something in Korean. Please do not take marks off. Oh, Peter Lee spoke Korean in class. It's called 무궁화꽃이 피었습니다, right? You know the thing I'm talking about? Apparently, it was a secret plan by Park Chung-hee government, right? To develop nuclear weapons for Korea. So Korea was developing nuclear weapons as well, and it decided not to. Thank God, right? Or maybe we're thinking, oh, maybe we should have done it because we'd be like North Korea now. I don't know. So Korea had a weapons program, and then it gave that up in exchange for, I guess, economic assistance. 190 countries signed. And then there are these other officially non-NPT states, India, Israel, North Korea, Pakistan, South Sudan. Israel is part of the NPT, but I'm sorry, it's not part of the NPT, but it's never like India and Pakistan, they're explicitly nuclear powers. They've tested nuclear explosions, so they are officially nuclear powers, but they're not officially part of the five official nuclear power countries. I'm sorry, I'm mangling what I'm saying here. The five are official nuclear powers because they have a special status at the UN, right? They're the five superpowers, right? And they can veto anything that happens at the UN. But India and Pakistan, they're not, right? Because they're not officially recognized as nuclear weapons countries. And Israel has always been ambiguous about whether they have nuclear weapons or not. But just recently, maybe just a couple of days ago, little Marco Rubio, apparently was asked, uh, like, what do you say about Israel being a nuclear weapon capable country? And he apparently said something like, "Yeah, yeah, of course, of course." He didn't say definitely, but uh, high probability or in all likelihood, they do have nuclear weapons. This is from like several years ago. So the figures are not accurate. 6,255 for Russia, over 5,000 for the United States. It says 350 for China. Somebody said China probably has something like 700 or something now. They're going to reach 1,000 pretty soon. And I think I said this in class, right? China doesn't want to stop. It wants to increase. It wants to increase the number of nuclear warheads because it feels like it's still being pushed around by the United States. Look, you guys have over 5,000. How come you're telling us to stop? And I'm not defending China here, but if you guys were China, like what else would you say? Like, wait a minute, you have more than 5,000 and you're telling us to stop building nuclear warheads. Well, if you're really serious about us getting rid of nuclear weapons, right? Why don't you get rid of all your I'm sorry, get rid of like, 4,500 of your nuclear weapons, right? If you reduce your nuclear warheads to less than 1,000, maybe we'll stop now, right? So it seems hypocritical for a country with this many nuclear warheads to tell other countries you must not have nuclear weapons. It seems very hypocritical. So that's the situation with the nuclear weapons. This thing that happened in the late 1960s, early 70s, this is called, people call this the triangular diplomacy, the period of triangular diplomacy where China and the Soviet Union, they had a falling out. They began to fight each other. Sorry, before that, 1964, China becomes a nuclear power, officially becomes a nuclear power. And then, yeah, this is called Sino-Soviet split in 1969. And they began to actually fight each other along the borders, and hundreds of soldiers were killed. And so once China and Soviet, two communist countries, began to be in this kind of bad relations, the United States, under this Henry Kissinger, I guess he's the guy, he's the architect of this, him and Nixon. Some people say Henry Kissinger is a monster. I've heard that said because Henry Kissinger's policies, foreign policies, ended up killing apparently up to like 1 million people. But people who respect Henry Kissinger say he was a brilliant man who guided the United States through this period of the Cold War to avoid a nuclear holocaust. So what the United States did was it it inserted itself between China and the Soviet Union at this time. So that's why it's called triangular diplomacy. The United States saw that they were having problems. It's like they're a couple fighting, right? It says, hey, why don't you guys divorce each other, right? And start dating me kind of thing. So it became a triangular situation instead of, the bipolar situation where it's the communists against the West. It became the West, the Soviet Union, and China became a triangular thing. Um, the USSR at the time were actually considering the use of nuclear weapons. Yet again, they wanted to attack China. And this wasn't just posturing. Apparently, the Chinese leaders at this time got so spooked that they started building nuclear bunkers. And I'm going to show you some pictures here. Yeah, these are like the nuclear bunkers that were built during that time because they really thought the Soviet Union was going to attack them with nuclear bombs. So the leaders could hide underground like this. And now it's like a tourist site, apparently. But this was the situation, and this is when the United States started saying, "Look, we're not going to stand by," because it started trying to create a diplomatic relationship with China, right? So it started saying, "Look, if you guys attack China with nuclear weapons, then we may attack you with nuclear weapons." They were never clear about this, but they gave certain hints, implications that that is what could happen. So their message was, please do not escalate, right? You guys may fight each other with conventional weapons, but if you bring in nuclear weapons, then we are going to get involved. Do not elevate the conflict. And so the Soviet Union backed off. And then Henry Kissinger, this is called shuttle diplomacy. They call this shuttle diplomacy because Henry Kissinger kept going back and forth. And the guy he ended up talking to most of the time was this guy named Zhou Enlai. So we'll talk about him a bit later. Right. So his secret diplomacy created a safe distance and a triangular relationship between the three. I suppose at this time, China wouldn't be considered a superpower. It was a great power, and there were still two superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States. And this was a diplomatic, what do you call it? A triumph of diplomat statesmanship, I suppose. So Henry Kissinger accomplished this surprise diplomatic accomplishment in the Nixon administration, where Nixon went to China. So he went straight into, until then, like China was considered this part of this evil communist empire. And then all of a sudden, China became a good country. China is actually not like the Soviet Union, those godless, communists. China is actually not like that, right? China is this ancient civilization. We can be friends. We can be friends with China. So this began the opening up of China to the rest of the world. So it was a triumph for Nixon's diplomacy, Henry Kissinger Nixon. This is a picture of him. And this is Zhou Enlai. Zhou Enlai, he was the premier of the Chinese government. And he was like sort of second in command, right? There's Mao Zedong, who's the absolute dictator, the chairman, Mao. And then Zhou Enlai was like his right-hand man. But the story about Zhou Enlai was he was ever the moderate. He was an intellectual. He was educated. I don't think he was an elite. He was a factory worker, but then he became educated. He spoke like French, and he was this intelligent, moderate, sort of maybe socialist, communist person. And his reputation in China is, I think, way up there above Mao Zedong. Chinese people love him, apparently. During the cultural and the Cultural Revolution, where the young people started like um, jailing and killing a lot of the intelligentsia, professionals, scholars. He apparently did a lot to protect the intelligentsia, the intelligent, the what do you call that class? Yeah, the intelligentsia. What? Intellectuals in China. Sorry. Thank you. The intellectuals. So the intelligentsia class of China was in many ways protected because of Zhou Enlai. And one of the people, one of the intellectuals uh, who were protected by Zhou Enlai was Deng Xiaoping. He could have died without Zhou Enlai's protection. And so what happened, this is an interesting story that happened. I just want to point this out. So he died, this is near, and then Mao Zedong died like almost a year after this. I think this was like 1975, 1976. He died, and then all of China grieved his death. But because I don't know exactly what the story was, either Mao Zedong was envious of how popular he was, or maybe it was more not him, but his wife. And there was this thing called Gang of Four, and they were in charge of basically running China like gangsters, right? And they didn't want people um, pouring out their adulations, right? Their like love for Zhao Enlai so publicly. So they said, do not take part in this event that was happening. So this isn't the funeral. This is something that happened after the funeral, but this is Tiananmen Square. And like thousands and thousands of Chinese people would go there to express their sorrow, right? Their love of Zhou Enlai. It was this spontaneous thing that was grassroots. And Deng Xiaoping had nothing to do with this. There's a spontaneous thing that happened, but the Chinese government blamed him for organizing this. And so because of this event, Deng Xiaoping apparently was kicked out of the inner circles of the Communist Party, and he would have rotted in jail, apparently. But Deng's events started happening. Mao Zedong died, and then the Gang of Four got arrested, and so Deng Xiaoping made a comeback. But that's the story. Because of this thing that happened in like 1975, 1976, he got into trouble with the Communist Party, and so it's highly ironic that Deng Xiaoping, this man, the man who made modern China, he is a hero, right? He is a moderate who opened China up to the rest of the world and basically made China what it is today, right? This hybrid of communist socialist country that is fully capitalist as well, right? Um, so this Tiananmen Square incident almost got him killed, right? Well, I don't know if, but almost, right? He was kicked out of the Communist Party. And in 1989, when there was this massive demonstration happening at the same place, Tiananmen Square, it was Deng Xiaoping who ordered the military. And that turned into what some people at least call the Tiananmen Square massacre. A lot of people died, a lot of young Chinese people died. So it's an ironic turn of events that the same square that in some ways um, got him in trouble, I guess uh, no, over a decade later would tarnish his reputation forever because of what he did with what was happening at Tiananmen Square. Or is this 1989? Yeah, I think this is 1989 when Deng Xiaoping decided. Apparently, like classified records show that he thought this was being organized by the United States. There were these anti-communist elements inciting the people to gather at the Tiananmen Square. So we cannot show any weakness. We have to show strength, and therefore send in the military. And this is what happened. This is a very famous picture, Tiananmen Square. All these tanks. they're stopped by this one man, and it's like a plastic bag that he's holding on to. It's like he went shopping. He's going back home. He saw these tanks, and he said, "Hey, what's going on?" Um, it's a very famous picture from that incident that happened in 1989. So this is the end of the conflict. Now we're jumping to the end, toward the end, 1979 to 79 to 89. Relations got tense again. So there was the détente, and then the relations between the Soviet Union and the United States got tense again. There was this event where the US boycotted 1980 Olympics because the USSR invaded Afghanistan. And Afghanistan turned into, I don't know all the details. The Mujahideen, I think, were the freedom fighters, the Islamic freedom fighters. So Afghanistan at this time turned into the Soviet Union's Vietnam, they say. This became their Vietnam. They only suffered for years trying to pacify the country, settle the country, and these Mujahideen fighters, freedom fighters, they would it's like Vietnam, right? So they ended up pulling out in 1989 at the end of the Cold War. It was only when Gorbachev, he's like a hero of this story that we're telling right now. He's the hero. When he came to power, he pulled out the Soviet troops. And of course, those freedom fighters, I can't say that properly. Mujahideen, the freedom fighters, Islamic freedom fighters who were backed by the CIA would turn into the terrorists of the later years. Uh, Osama bin Laden was apparently part of this kind of movement, let us be free of the Western powers, and they were helped by the CIA. The enemy of my enemy, I guess, is my friend or something. It was that kind of situation. In comes Ronald Reagan. He did not want um, the status quo. He did not want the same situation to continue. He wanted to defeat the Soviet Union. So he came in, and his policy had always been to be aggressive against the Soviet Union. And a lot of people called him a warmonger, that Ronald Reagan was a warmonger because of the things he said. Like one of the famous things that he said when he became president was he called the Soviet Union an evil empire, he said, an evil empire. And he began to have a massive arms buildup. He began to build more, I think, nuclear weapons as well. They had this nuclear weapons treaty, and then apparently, at first, he broke it and he began to build more weapons. And he began this thing called SDI. SDI, I think this is a division of Samsung company nowadays. SDI, Samsung like development something. But anyway, SDI at this time was SDI was Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI. And this was a science fictiony thing. They called this the Star Wars, the Star Wars project. I guess that's what they called it. The idea was that they would have these space satellites that are weaponized. They would have weapons. These satellites, they would orbit, cover the entire planet, right? But they would have weapons. And then what they could do was, if the Soviet Union launched all their missiles, right, SDI could take them out. Intercontinental ballistic missiles go out of the atmosphere. That's why they're intercontinental ballistic missiles. They go out of the atmosphere and then they come back into the atmosphere. That's how they cover so much distance. And then while they're outside the atmosphere, they could be tracked and then taken out by these SDI technology. They say this was never realistic. This was actually science fiction, right? So part of it at least was propaganda. Of course, I mean, you never know when they were promoting the project, promises were made, and I'm sure these part of the military complex, the industry probably oversold the idea, right? They say, yeah, we could have this operational maybe in the next like 5 years, 10 years. The problem is that the Soviet Union believed this was a real thing, right? The appearance sometimes becomes reality. The Soviet Union thought this was a real thing, that the United States was doing. And then this was destroying the balance of power. So at this time, um, I'm talking about this now from like my personal experience because you know I was I was a fully grown adult at this time, right? A lot of people were very critical of Ronald Reagan. I hated him. I'm sorry to say this. I hated him because we thought uh, what they're doing is really, really dangerous, right? This Cold War could continue because there was this balance of power. Both superpowers knew that if there was anything that would disturb the balance of power, it could create the danger of a hot war, right? A hot nuclear war where that would kill everybody, right? He's playing with everyone's lives, with the entire planet. Like, what is he doing? Is destroying the balance of power. So for a while, people were really scared. Like, what would the Soviet Union do, right? Because if they let SDI continue, then Ronald Reagan is saying we're gaining the upper hand, right? We want the evil empire to end. So for a while, things were very tense. So this is how the conflict ended, right? Things began to be really tense. There were and during this time there were several nuclear scares during this time. I'm just going to mention two of these things. When the world came to what we say the brink of nuclear annihilation. This is called Petrov incident. This is 1983. I guess this is before, no, I think this is during Ronald Reagan, 83, 89. Ronald Reagan, George H. Bush came, he was the president at the end of the Cold War era. So I think this is Ronald Reagan's time. What happened at this time is September 1983. The Soviet Union had this monitoring system, and the monitoring system said the Americans have fired their nuclear weapons. The monitoring system said we're being attacked. And this guy named, I think I have his picture here, Stanislav Petrov. Um, he was this young officer at the time, and the story is he was supposed to report what was happening to his superiors, right? The monitoring system says multiple nuclear warheads are coming our way, right? He was supposed to report what he was monitoring, what he was seeing right away to his superiors. But Petrov, this young man, I guess he was idealistic, right? He said, I cannot believe what I am seeing. Literally, he said, I cannot believe what I'm seeing, right? And I know that if I report this to my superiors, it's going to go up the chain of command, right? And they're going to fire missiles to the United States. And once that happens, all out nuclear war. So he decided not to report what he was seeing. And it turned out it was a malfunction, right? Something about some clouds, some formation of clouds, and it was being mistaken by the machine, the monitoring system, into being like missiles. So this guy, this one person saying, I cannot believe my own eyes, I guess he thought maybe behind that is, I cannot believe the United States would attack us like this. Maybe he had this idea that the United States is not, they're not monsters and they would not do this. It doesn't make any sense. He received this, I checked this out, Future of Life Award. Apparently this is tiny little thing. The award was like $50,000. Heroically ensuring that a false alarm did not escalate into a cataclysmic nuclear war on September 26, 1983. But the interesting thing about this guy, Stanislav Petrov, is, yeah, this is him accepting the award along with $50,000. Apparently what happened with him was he was punished. He was punished even after everything came out. Yeah, you saved the world. Congratulations, comrade. But we have to punish you because you disobeyed orders, right? You're supposed to report what you were seeing and you failed to report. What if it had been? What if it had been real nuclear weapons, right? This is a break in the chain of command. So we have to punish you. So apparently he was punished. He saved the world and he was punished. So this is my second incident that we're telling you. The one was the nuclear submarine B-59, right? And this is Petrov. Another thing that happened, and this was on the United States side. This is September. Only 2 months later, the NATO they were having their military exercise, and they were doing something that they had not done before. Some kind of realistic simulation. It was a simulation of a nuclear war that they were doing. And they thought they had notified the Soviet Union, that they knew that this was just an exercise, a war exercise. But the USSR thought that that was a trick. This was the preparation for a real nuclear attack, and they prepared to launch their missiles. So this was another, they say, very close call where if the United States thought that the Soviet Union was moving their missiles, then the Americans would have had to move their missiles, get them ready for like, what do you call it, DEFCON, DEFCON 2, DEFCON 1 or something. And then after DEFCON 1 is, fire. And somebody at this time I guess it was part of NATO or the White House, somebody said, you know what? We have to assume that the Soviet Union is doing this because they're seeing what we're doing, right? Let's just make this assumption that their movement, that their military movement is in response to the war exercise that we're doing. No, but we told them this is just an exercise. Yeah, but maybe they don't believe us, right? So what they're doing is defensive posturing. They're not really going to attack us. So let's not do anything to make the situation even more dangerous, right? They were supposed to move their missiles as well, but they didn't do anything. And apparently that stopped the situation from escalating. That this is called it's not the NATO exercise. They have a name for this. Some kind of arrow, some kind of broken arrow, some exercise. They have a name for this. And they say this, again, came very close to a real nuclear exchange. So we mentioned three incidents, right? The nuclear sub, Petrov, and this NATO exercise. Apparently, there were several more. When there's a thing called moonrise scare or something, where moon was rising, and because of the way the moon was rising a certain way, again, I think this was in the American side, the American monitoring system said the Soviets are attacking us with nuclear weapons. And so apparently that was another like very close call. So this was a situation with the Cold War. And like I said, because of Ronald Reagan, he destroyed the status quo and people were very scared. Is this the end, right? Is this the end? Will we make it to 1990? Along comes Mikhail Gorbachev. He became the leader in 1985. And at first, people didn't know what to make of Gorbachev, Mr. Gorbachev. Everyone loves him now, but for a while, because he was the official leader of the Soviet Union, people just naturally assumed that he was an evil man representing the evil empire, right? Godless communists. But apparently what happened with Gorbachev was he saw what was happening in the Soviet Union, that, past the propaganda, what was actually happening, like economically, militarily, was that the situation was not sustainable, that he had to create a more friendly relations with the West. So he began to reach out. He began to reform the USSR. And for a while, these two words, if you guys don't know these two words, for a while, everyone knew these words, glasnost and perestroika. These were entered into the English dictionary, right, as regular English words, because it represented a reformed Soviet Union. Gorbachev said, we're going to make the Soviet Union honest, right? No more propaganda. We're going to be honest. We're going to deal with each other in openness, glasnost, and we're going to restructure the Soviet Union, make us economically prosperous again, perestroika, a new beginning. And it's really Gorbachev who ended the Cold War, right? I mean, you could say Ronald Reagan too, because toward the end, Ronald Reagan changed. He, I think I said this, maybe not Ronald Reagan. Did I say this with Harry Truman? Like some of these guys, they're considered sort of um, mediocre people, right? Mediocre people, politicians, and then they grow into the job. And Ronald Reagan is one of those people, one of those, um, I guess, politicians who grew into the job. So he began to change his own attitude about the Soviet Union. They formed a very close working relationship, Reagan and Gorbachev. And these two men together ended the Cold War. Mikhail Gorbachev, he died only 4 years ago. And what happened to him was rather tragic. There was a coup against Gorbachev in 1991. So this is after the fall of the Berlin Wall, right? But the Soviet Union still existed, and Gorbachev, he allowed like local elections to happen, allowed basically democracy to happen. And Gorbachev's vision, I think, was to turn the Soviet Union into a federation of nations. They would have a federation of these Eastern European nations, and everyone would be at peace. And then the hardliners, the communist military and politicians, they had this coup against Gorbachev. They locked them inside this compound. But then the coup failed because of, and once the coup failed, the USSR collapsed December 1991. They had to dissolve the union because of the coup. And the coup failed because of this man, Mr. Boris Yeltsin. He had become the president of Russia through fair election. So he had become the president of Russia, but at this time Russia was still under the Soviet Union, right? And he very boldly, this was his probably one heroic act that he climbed he climbed on this tank and he said, we will not give in to these fools, right? We will assert our right. And he stared down the coup leaders, and the coup leaders didn't really know what they were doing. They didn't really know what they were doing, so they ended up backing down. And then the story is Boris Yeltsin hated Gorbachev and he intentionally humiliated him. And once the coup happened, Yeltsin took on all the power because he was the Russian president, right? He took on upon himself all the powers of the government and left Gorbachev powerless. So toward the end, Gorbachev became sort of a paper type of figure, and then the official dissolution of the Soviet Union happened in December 1991. But the Cold War ended much earlier than that, in 1989, I guess, when the Berlin Wall came down. That was officially sort of the end of the Cold War. And then what happened with Gorbachev, not Gorbachev, Boris Yeltsin is, let me know if I'm wrong, because the stories that I have may not be correct, right? These are stories that I have. The story of Boris Yeltsin is that he was a corrupt man. He was your typical Russian uncle type figure, right? He was popular. He was a character, but he was an alcoholic. He was always drunk. He was always drinking, and he allowed a lot of corruption to creep into the government. And so he began to be afraid that he would be prosecuted. And then, of course, these illegal activities that he allowed to happen under his watch, maybe relatives, close friends, would come back to bite him. And he did not want to end up in jail. And therefore, hey, it's okay. It's all right. Let's just, how much time do we have? Oh no, wait a minute. We're at the end. Why didn't anybody tell me we're at the end? Wait a minute, is that right? 2:45, shoot. Uh, so he promoted this young KGB officer by the name of Putin, Vladimir Putin, and he took over as the leader of Russia. And everyone liked Putin at the beginning, right? They thought, hey, he's a young guy, right? A bureaucrat. Russia Federation. Who knew that he would turn out to be the man that he is now? The American century, shoot, what am I going to do? We're not finished. I haven't even gone to the end of history. Let me just quickly go through this. Let's at least finish the Cold War. The American century, the phrase was first used by Henry Luce. He's the founder of Time Magazine, Life Magazine, so he's his sort of intellectual, I guess, multimillionaire. He started using the phrase American century, and the phrase took. People started talking about the American century starting from 1945. Um, and for a while, like I said, right after the Cold War, there was a unipolar moment where the United States was the sole superpower and nobody resisted, right? At this time, everyone was happy to have the United States in charge of the world. NATO, the EU, the EU established 1990, and then the Gulf War, 1991. The United States was still very popular uh, to have and happy to have the US act as the world police. WTO established in 1994. The US-style trade rules, people were mostly happy with it, right? The US led the globalization of the entire world economy. And at this time, Fukuyama, because everyone was happy, right? The Pax Americana, right? Caused this guy, this American, Japanese American political scientist, it caused him to write this thing called The End of History. We have reached the end of history. Western liberal democracy won. There are no more worthy opponents left. Religious extremism, ultranationalism, fascism, these are tiny little villains, right? There's no real enemy left. The West has won, the end of history. And this is the thing that I wanted to talk to you guys about. I thought I would have about, I don't know, 20 minutes, but we're out of time. And then that was not the end of history because along came 9/11, 2001, the war in Afghanistan, and then the world splintered when it came to Iraq. If you guys don't know, this is something that we lived through. I was actually in Korea when this happened. I saw this on the street, like on some TV by some store. This is how I learned about 9/11. This shocked the world, and everyone was on the side of the United States. So when the United States invaded Afghanistan, because Afghanistan wouldn't allow the United States to pursue Osama bin Laden, the United States invaded Afghanistan, and the entire world was with the United States. They wanted to help the United States get its revenge. And then George W. Bush, he had to push things one step more, and he invaded Iraq, and that splintered the West because they said this is not seeking revenge after 9/11. This is you playing nation building, right? Nation building, regime change in Iraq. So that's when the world started going downhill, I think, more. That is it. Right now, if we are entering a new Cold War, it's between the United States and China. And of all people, I don't know if we should say credit, people credit of all people, Obama for starting the United States on this path toward China, which is a surprising thing because we don't think of Obama as, I mean, he won the Nobel Peace Prize, right? Right at the beginning of his presidency. Without him doing anything, the Nobel Committee gave him the Nobel Peace Prize right at the beginning. So people didn't know what to make of it. But soon he implemented this policy called pivot to Asia. He began to pivot the American economic forces, the American military to focus more on Asia. And the rationale was China is growing too powerful. Right? It's becoming too powerful. We need to contain China. So this was part of what he did. This is a picture. He was visiting, I think this was Japan. And there's President Park Geun-hye and Abe before he was assassinated, right? This was part of his pivot to Asia. And when Donald Trump came into power, he continued this policy, right? Started his trade war, first time with China. And then when Well, I think I showed you this picture before. This is how China, the economic might of China grew from in like a couple of decades. So people thought once Joe Biden came into office that the policy would change, right? Donald Trump, he's a villainous man. He wanted to start a war with China, but this trade war would certainly, yes.
I'm so sorry.
Oh, shoot. Uh, so this is where we are today. Yeah, I'm not gonna. So what I'm gonna do is, because today is the last class, the end of history, globalism, we're gonna skip all this. I'm just going to ask you guys one thing to watch this video, and I'll make an announcement regarding this, and I'm going to give you some kind of bait, a stick, carrot stick thing. One of the questions on the exam is going to be from this video. I'll give it out as a bonus question. I'll make an announcement. That is the one thing I'll ask you guys to do. Otherwise, you can ignore this PDF file. C28 Modern Period 4, you can ignore this. I'm sorry I kept you long. Some of you, I'll see you Tuesday. The rest, I'll see you Thursday for the final exam. Have a wonderful weekend.